join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Rabbi Dr. Daniel Gordon.
Is this on? No. There we go. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. Pleasure to have a chance to share some thoughts with you. I'll put some stuff out up front, but then I hope we can actually open it up for some real questions and discussion and so on and so forth. But let me begin by saying this. The idea of whether or not a state should exist is, of course, a very peculiar question, right? I mean, you don't ask that question about France, and you don't ask that question about Thailand, you don't ask that question about Russia. It's an unusual thing to ask a question about whether or not you actually need a certain kind of a country. And it's not because Israel is so new, by the way. Israel is actually older than 2/3 of the countries in the world. Israel was country number 61 or 62 when it was admitted to the United Nations. There's now 180-something countries in the UN. So the idea that Israel is the subject of so much discussion because it's so new is actually false. Most of the countries in the world are actually much younger than Israel. So obviously a large measure of the question about whether or not you need a Jewish state is because of two major reasons. One of them is that Israel's not like other countries. It was a country conceived of and formed for the flourishing of a particular community, which it's hard to say about some other countries. And of course, the conflict raises the question as well. Since people always say the conflict is costing so much in blood, sweat, tears, money, and so on and so forth, is it actually really worth it? So what we're going to try to do today is lay out some of the basic reasons that Israel was created. It's a little bit interesting. And we're going to try to lay out some of the various reasons that Israel was created. And I want to try to make the argument about why Israel matters both for the Jews, but also for the world. And then once we do that, we'll open it up and we can take some questions and see where the conversation leads us. So before we get to the question of why some of us today might actually think that the country needs to exist, we can ask ourselves at the beginning, well, why did other people think it needed to exist? Why, when Herzl created it, did he think that Israel needed to exist? Why, when millions of Jews around the world got excited by Herzl's book, The Jewish State, in 1896, why did they get excited? What did they think was going on? Now, the first thing that needs to be said, therefore, is that Israel's created in large measure as a result of European anti-Semitism. People already at the end of the 19th century, at the end of the 1800s, had a deep-seated sense that something in Europe was not going to work for the Jews. You need to remember, for example, that Poland had been the center of the Jewish world. We take it for granted now, by the way, right? Most of the world's Jews live in Israel and America. You add up the Jews of Israel and America today, you get about 85% of the world's Jews. In 1880, if you had added up all the Jews who lived in America and in what was then Palestine, now Israel, you would have gotten about 5% of the world's Jews. Complete change. The two communities where most of the Jews in the world live are actually, relatively speaking, brand new communities. Israel is fundamentally a new community not only because of statehood in 48, but because in the early part of the 20th century, there were only a few thousand Jews there. They were kind of what's called the old Yeshuv. They were very deeply religious, very pious, dependent entirely on contributions from the outside. They lived in an entirely Muslim-controlled country. They kept to themselves. They were only minimally bothered, and that was what there was. In the United States, there were a few 100,000 Jews, nothing like what would eventually happen between 1880 and 1920, when millions and millions of Jews, approximately 4 million Jews, would make their way to America. But people in the end of the 1800s already had this sense that Europe was going to go south. They had a foreboding sense that something was happening in Europe because of pogroms in 1880 and 81, and a whole array of other things going on, which they said, this is not going to end well. And the only way to make sure that the Jewish people survives is to actually create a Jewish state. Now, we're not going to go into all of the details of that, but suffice it to say that was one of the very basic reasons. This notion of Israel, or what would eventually become Israel, as a haven, a place where the Jews would actually not live at the whim or the will of anyone else. You don't go to Poland and hope the Polish don't turn on you. You don't go to England and hope that the English don't turn on you, as they did in 1290 and kicked all the Jews out. You don't go to Spain and hope that the Spanish won't turn on you, which they did in 1492. And of course, you don't go to Central and Eastern Europe and hope that they won't turn on you, which of course they did in 1938 to 1945, and wipe out a third of the world's Jews, 90% of Polish Jews, and so on and so forth. So part of this, of course, is a sense that the Jewish history tells you something. Jewish history actually makes it clear that no matter how good it looks in a particular diaspora at any given point, things always change. Always. Not most of the time, always. Now, I'm not making any predictions, please don't get me wrong. I'm not making any predictions about America here. Nobody knows what the future holds. Nobody knows what could happen here in 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. Nobody has any idea. But I will point out to you, by the way, that the people that are advocates of this idea do point out, for example, that 30 years ago, the idea of people marching in Charlottesville, holding up signs, Jews will not replace us, and having a lot of people in Washington not being willing to actually talk that down as clearly as needed to be done, would have been unthinkable, and we all know that it's happened within the last year. The ADL put out a study this past week saying that the number of anti-Semitic incidences this past year is the highest ever since it's actually started measuring a number of decades ago. So the people that are advocates of that position argue that the Jews are actually safe nowhere in any society. I think it's a little bit early to start making all kinds of dire predictions about America, but certainly the idea of refuge was one of the major ideas. Now, for a very long time, that seemed to be an idea that was actually kind of dwindling in its value, because it seemed like those who wanted to come to Israel had come to Israel. Those who didn't want to come weren't going to come, and life was going to be more or less okay for those who stayed outside. We all understand now, of course, that life in Poland is changing very, very rapidly for Polish Jews. And we understand that if Marine Le Pen ultimately gets elected in France, life could change very dramatically for French Jews. And we understand that Jeremy Corbyn, who's the head of the Labour Party in London, is no friend of the Jews. And we understand that what's happening in Austria and in Hungary and so on and so forth, with all the right-wing parties coming to power, you have the same thing going on in Greece. There are a lot of reasons to worry about those small Jewish communities. So ironically, the idea that the Jewish state actually affords some sort of refuge to people is an issue that people actually think about more today than they did, let's say, 15, 20 years ago. Now, one mistake that Theodor Herzl did make, though, was that he assumed that the minute the Jews had a state of their own, they wouldn't seem so strange to Europeans in general, and that European anti-Semitism would stop. So for Herzl, there was another reason, and that reason was, the reason that there's European anti-Semitism is that the Jews are weird. What other kind of people doesn't have a country of its own? What kind of a people always lives at the behest of somebody else, always lives as somebody else's largesse? Said Herzl, we're the only ones. If we were actually a people that had our own country, then like a Frenchman living in Germany. The Germans don't pick on Frenchmen living in Germany because what do they care? Germany's a normal country, France is a normal country. If somebody's visiting, somebody's visiting. But if somebody's visiting because they have nowhere else to go, nowhere else to call their own, said Herzl, then that brings out all the antipathy of Europe. And Herzl predicted, without any question whatsoever, that if the Jews got a state of their own, that would bring an end to European anti-Semitism. Herzl was a very smart guy. That one he got entirely and completely wrong. The existence of the State of Israel, tragically, I mean just tragically, has not brought about an end to anti-Semitism, but we certainly do understand that what Israel does first and foremost is it means that there is no place on earth where Jews, wherever they live, don't know that if anything should happen to the place in which they find themselves, they know that they have a place to go. There is no Jew on earth who doesn't have a place to go. And we have to remember that not that long ago, that was not the case, right? There were Polish Jews after the war who went back to their shtetls because the borders of Palestine had been sealed by the British. They were let out of DP camps. There was nowhere to go but home, and they were, of course, many of them killed by the Poles when they got back to their towns. There were hundreds of thousands of people in displaced persons camps who stayed there because there was simply nowhere to go. America had immigration limitations. Canada had immigration limitations. The borders of Palestine were sealed by the British. The idea of a Jew who has nowhere to go on planet Earth, that's really just over. Remember the story of the boat, The Exodus, right? Filled with people, teeming with people, get stopped by the British, turned around, they get taken to Cyprus, they get taken wherever they get taken. That doesn't happen anymore. And in that regard, Israel's been an enormous success. Now, we said, of course, it hasn't been a success in terms of making sure that European anti-Semitism would go away, but that's another conversation. But let's leave the issue of refuge aside completely. What else happens to the Jewish people by virtue of their being a Jewish state? There was a historian named Barbara Tuchman, a Jewish woman. My alarm is going, there we go. A Jewish woman who is primarily not a historian of the Jewish people. She was mostly a historian of America. She actually a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, and she made a very interesting point. She said this 20, 30 years ago. She said, of all of the people in the West, forget the Far East where things are very different, but of all of the peoples of the West, there is only one people that lives in the same place, practices the same religion, and speaks the same language as it did thousands of years ago. There's nobody else. Some people live in the same place but don't speak the same language. Some people speak the same language but don't have the same religion. There's no other people, Barbara Tuchman said, that speaks the same language, practices the same religion, and lives in the same place as they did thousands of years ago. And what she was trying to point out is that what Israel has done is to really reconstitute the Jews as a people. What does it mean to be a people? When you think of the French people, or you think of the Russian people, what do you have in mind? Well, you have in mind certainly a place that they call their own. You can't imagine French culture without Paris, and without Normandy, and without all different sorts of areas of France. You can't imagine Italian culture without Venice, and without Rome, and without Siena, and so on and so forth. And Moscow and St. Petersburg and so forth for Russian culture. These are the cities that are deeply rooted, steeped in the culture of that country, and place is necessary to actually having a sense of a people, being a genuine people. So one of its place. The other issue, of course, is language. The French are the French in large measure because of the French language. You don't have French literature in any other language, and Chaim Nachman Bialik put it very well when he said, whenever you translate any good text from one language to another, it's like kissing the bride through the veil, which is to say, it's a kiss, but it's not the stuff of which dreams are made. You lose something. There's an immediacy that's lost. And one of the things that we take for granted now, of course, that Jews speak Hebrew, that Hebrew is a vibrant language. But we have to remember, obviously, that Hebrew was a vibrant language because it was a Zionist project. Hebrew was reconstituted because not only Eliezer ben Yehuda, and by the way, Hebrew never died entirely. That's an exaggeration. It never died entirely. It certainly continued to exist liturgically. It certainly continued to exist in all kinds of classic Jewish texts. And even in certain cases, there were people writing mostly religious stuff, but Hebrew never entirely disappeared. But as a spoken language, it was really basically completely gone. And Eliezer ben Yehuda, who eventually moved to Jerusalem, decides that the Jews, if they're going to have a country of their own, also need a language, which is strange when you think about it. Because the one thing that the Jews who came from Russia and Germany and Poland and Egypt and Iraq and Iran and Yemen all had in common was that they didn't speak Hebrew. Right? They all spoke different kinds of things, but none of them spoke Hebrew. You could have imagined making a decision to have Russian be the language of the country, because that's where the vast majority of the early immigrants came from. You could have imagined the world in which German was the language of the country, because that was where a large part of the intelligentsia came from. You could have imagined Arabic, because that was the lingua franca of the place where they were building the state, and a lot of the Jews back then actually spoke Arabic. The decision to use Hebrew is a decision to actually revitalize what is a critical part of any genuine people's culture, which is its own unique language, its own unique way of saying things. And I was actually reminded about the degree to which there was once, even in American Jewish life, a kind of a real enthusiasm about Hebrew just this past week. My father passed away a couple years ago. My mom is living in a different place, but we kind of held on to their apartment for a number of years, but now we're selling it. And in preparation for its being sold, my wife and I'm the only kid in Israel of the three brothers. So my wife and I have been going through all kinds of stuff and finding all these boxes of papers. And some of you have had this experience, of course. And in a lot of ways, it's very sad. In a lot of ways, it's very heartwarming. In a lot of ways, you want to say, what in the world were they thinking when they saved this? Okay. But in my mom's desk, we found a little envelope, not labeled, all just rolled up. And I was literally just about to toss it with all the old bank statements and they kept every single possible expired credit card or their AAA cards going back to 1950, things that are really very valuable. There was this envelope stuffed in there, and I was just about to toss it when I said, let's just see what's in it. And I opened it up, and it was all the letters and the telegrams that my parents had gotten the week of their wedding in 1955. So the telegrams, obviously, this will shock you, you could not send Hebrew telegrams in the United States of America. So the telegrams were all in English, and most of the letters written by fellow Americans to my parents and their parents who are also living in America, in other words, are American Jews writing to other American Jews, almost all the letters are in mellifluous, flowery, Agnonian Hebrew. There was this period, both of my parents who grew up in New York, they're both born in 34,
Both of my parents grew up in Hebrew-speaking homes, one in Brooklyn and one in Far Rockaway. I mean, there were these little clusters of kind of Zionist intellectual clans where people actually raised their kids in the 30s and the 40s in Hebrew because it was understood that part of what Zionism was about was the rebirth of the Jewish people. And if you can't have a French people, as I said before, without French, you can't have a Russian people without the Russian language. You needed to have a Jewish language too. And I just want to remind you what an unbelievable thing it is. It's not an exaggeration to say that in 1880, you could have taken every single person on planet Earth who spoke Hebrew and put them in this room. And there would have been room left over. They could have had a lot more leg room than some of you have. In other words, there was nobody there. And now you fast forward not all that much time later, and there are literally, obviously, 8 million people in Israel who speak Hebrew, and plenty of people outside who speak Hebrew. And if you go into a bookstore, hundreds of linear feet of books written in Hebrew, everything from really great stuff like Amos Oz to trash, to travel books, to cookbooks, to Hebrew translations of 50 Shades of Grey, which I'm sure Eliezer Ben Yehuda is not happy about. But what are you going to do? You know, you put a language out there, people are going to do with it. We also translate Shakespeare, so that's good. But so one of the things that's important to remember is that what Israel has done is it has given birth to the Jewish people as a people, not as clusters of people living here or there, Yemenite Jews or Iraqi Jews or American Jews or French Jews, but it has actually created peoplehood, and we'll come back to that in a minute, by virtue in no small measure of having recreated Hebrew as a vibrant language. Another question we could talk about some other time is the reasons for and the costs of American Jews not having made Hebrew fluency a priority. Because people in Europe learn lots of different languages without much difficulty. We're not any less smart than they are, and we don't learn second languages so much. So, I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But so the first one is we end the idea of Jews having no place to go. We create an existential situation in which Jews everywhere know there's a place for them on planet Earth. Number two, we revitalize Hebrew, which then makes the Jewish people a people like all others. And I think it's important to remember, by the way, if you had gone just this past year to the awards for the Man Booker Prize in London, you would have seen that there are 5 finalists worldwide, all over the world. The 5 finalists for the Man Booker Prize, 2 of them were Amos Oz and David Grossman, for books written, obviously, in Hebrew. And David Grossman obviously won for A Horse Walks Into a Bar. It's in English. It's a hard book in certain ways. I mean, a kind of an emotionally difficult book, but a really interesting read. But the extraordinary thing of about a century after Eliezer Ben Yehuda did his work, 2 of the 5 finalists for the Man Booker Prize are writing books in a language that 100 years ago nobody spoke, is actually a metaphor for the rapid success of Zionism in lots of kinds of ways. Another thing that Israel does, think about the Bible. Think about Moses, think about Joshua, think about King David, think about Saul, think about Solomon, think about all different kinds of people. There's good characters and there's bad characters, and they make mistakes and they do some things well, etc., etc., etc. But the Bible, which is kind of our national diary, giving us a sense of who we once were, understands the Jews as actors in history. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. Sometimes we behave well, sometimes we don't behave well. We have to march through the desert, we cross the Jordan. You can like the story of how we get the land, you cannot like the story of how we get the land. You can like how we deal with the Philistines, you cannot like how we deal with the Philistines. You can like how Solomon expands his empire, you cannot like how Solomon expands his empire. But it is what it is. In other words, the Jews were actors in history, and the Zionists also felt that there's something fundamentally aberrant about a people whose origins are the people that the Bible tells the story of, who are definitely actors in history, now for 2,000 years, basically sitting on the sidelines of history. Yes, they're writing books. Yes, they're engaged in the professions. Yes, they're doing all kinds of fascinating intellectual things. Yes, they're building nice communities. Yes, and yes, and yes. This is not to suggest that during those thousands of years, Jews just sat by the rivers of Babylon and cried. We didn't. But to the Zionists, there was also a sense that the real peoples of the world are actors in history. Some are bishops, and some are castles, and some are knights. Maybe some are pawns, but they're all on the chessboard. They move. They do certain kinds of things. And the Jews, they said, are aberrant in the sense that we're not actors in history. And of course, Zionism as an idea and then the Jewish state as a reality has definitely restored the Jewish people to being actors in history. Now again, you can ask yourself, have we done it well? Have we not done it well? It depends on who you look at and when, right? Were Jews very proud in June 1967? Jews were very proud in June 1967. Were Jews very proud in 1982 with Sabra and Shatila? Most Jews were not very proud of Sabra and Shatila, to put it very mildly. When I went to Tel Aviv a week ago Saturday night to participate in an anti-deportation rally to oppose the government's plan to deport the illegal immigrants who came across the border years and years and years ago, my own personal view is that to get rid of these people would be to do a terrible thing. Do I not understand the crime problem? I understand the crime problem. Do I not understand that they're there illegally? I understand that they're there illegally. Do I not understand that property values in South Tel Aviv are literally zero? You can't give your apartment away. I understand that property values in Tel Aviv are literally zero. I understand all those things. And so do most of the 20,000 people who came out a week ago Saturday night to participate in this rally. But they also say that what it means to be an actor in history is to have to figure out complicated solutions to complicated problems that don't satisfy every single need right away. So being an actor in history means that you can actually whisk in Jews from Yemen, or you can whisk in Jews from Ethiopia, or you can whisk in Jews from Iraq and Iran. It means that if you're Menachem Began and the first thing that you hear about after you're elected prime minister, even before you're sworn in, is that there's a group of Vietnamese boat people out on the Chinese Sea who are literally starving to death. The adults were getting 1 teaspoon of water a day, and the children were getting 2 teaspoons of water a day. And ship after ship, foreign ship, was going by these people and not picking them up, not doing anything for them. When an Israeli freighter called the Yuvali was shipping by there, saw them, radioed in and said, "What do we do?" And Began, who was not even yet sworn in, said, "Bring them on board, we will give them medical care, and we will make them all citizens," which is exactly what he did. And by the way, Carter, who was no great lover of Israel, actually commended Began for that when they had the whole peace ceremony and so forth. It means, by the way, when you're an actor in history, that even though the Syrians are your sworn enemy, that sometimes what you do is you send your own soldiers, and this includes some of my students at Shalem College, you send your own soldiers across the border into Syria. You scoop up some, I mean, there's too many to bring them all, but you scoop up some of the people who are the most grievously injured, you bring them back into Israel. It means that if you bring them to the hospital in Tzfat, and it's a 4-year-old kid who is not old enough to understand that when you go back to Syria, you can never say you were in Israel because he just isn't old enough to understand that, but he's not young enough not to realize that he's not in a place where people are speaking Hebrew. This is an actual case. So what you do is you bring him and his mother in, and every doctor and every nurse who speaks to him in Arabic. Every sign in Hebrew is covered up, and all he sees is Arabic. He has surgery after surgery after surgery. He's in the hospital, in Ziv Hospital in Tzfat for months, and when he finally gets taken back to Syria, he has no idea he was ever in the state of Israel. That's a moment we can all be proud of. And like every country, whether it's the United States or it's France or it's Germany or it's Russia, there are going to be moments that we're going to be proud of and there are moments that we're going to be ashamed of, because that's what it means to be an actor in history. That's what it means to be a human being on a personal level. That's what it means to be a people on a general level. You will do certain things right. You will do certain things wrong. The strange thing about Israel's situation, of course, is whenever it does anything wrong, then the question comes, does Israel really have a right to exist? Right, the United States does something that's not so rosy. Nobody says, does America have a right to exist? When France does something that nobody thinks is a good idea, nobody says, does France have a right to exist? It's really a unique thing about the Jewish state, which is why we're having this conversation in the first place. So number one, we restore this idea, which we had in the time of the Bible, the Jews have a home, which means that there's no Jew anywhere in the world who doesn't have a place to go. Number two, we actually restore language, among many other things. We create a culture and a people so that once 150 years ago, a Jew from Yemen, what did a Jew from Yemen have in common to do with a Jew from Moscow? What did a Jew in Boston have in common with a Jew in Baghdad? Really, what did they have in common? The Zionist project, beginning in 1897, was the first project in thousands of years that Jews in Yemen and Baghdad and Paris and London and New York and Moscow all worked on together. We take it for granted now when we say the Jewish people. But the Jewish people for 2,000 years was an idea, it wasn't a reality. A Jew in Yemen and a Jew in St. Petersburg, what does that mean? They're part of the same people. Not the same language, barely the same religious practices, some of the same texts, that's true. Not necessarily the same beliefs. Jewish people, what does that actually mean? Well, it means something, to be sure, but it doesn't mean anything like what it means once that people can all contribute to and rally around a specific kind of a state. Just going to grab my water for 1 second. Now, I want to say something about Israel and the rest of the world. The Jews were not the only people for a very long time who didn't have a state of their own. To this very day, right? The Chechens don't have a state of their own. The Basques don't have a state of their own. We're all keenly aware that the Palestinians don't have a state of their own. The Catalonians, new to the march, don't have a state of their own. Native Americans, by the way, don't have a state of their own. And if you want to know why you never hear about Native Americans wanting a state of their own, talk to them and ask them what happens to them when they begin to talk about that in the privacy of their own circles, and just how willing the FBI is for those conversations to happen. Not a well-known story, but you think it never occurred to them? They're just stupid. They're sitting on reservations and they read the paper and they watch television and they see the Kurds and they see the Chechens and they see the Catalonians and they see the Jews and they see all those other people and they never say to themselves, well, what about us? But it just never occurred to them? Think about it for a second. I mean, it's just ridiculous, right? They know very well what other peoples in the world are doing, but they also understand very well that the United States has absolutely zero tolerance for forget action, any conversation about that. And there's parts of America in dealing with Native Americans that you would not be happy at all to know what was going on. The Jews for a very long time have been a people that have been a source of hope for others. Give you just a couple of examples. If you open up any good anthology of Negro spirituals, before the war, during the war, and whatever, you will see, everybody knows the famous one, right? Go down Moses, way down to Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. But there are many. There's actually these spirituals are unbelievably beautiful, and if you actually go onto iTunes, you can download albums of them. I mean, they're really amazingly beautiful constructs. And if you listen carefully, the issue of Egypt and of Moses and of the Jewish people and God redeeming the Jews infused African Americans with a sense of hope for a very long time in a way that no other people's history ever infused them with hope. The Jews have been a kind of a symbol to people all over the world about this kind of survival. Not that long ago, probably 20 years or so ago, the Dalai Lama actually sent emissaries to American Judaism, to the United States, to talk to American Jews and ask them about how they have managed to perpetuate themselves even in exile and even as a small minority. Now, whether the solutions that American Jews used would work there is an open question. Whether the solutions are actually working here, I think, is to a certain extent an open question. But it doesn't matter. When the Dalai Lama surveyed the entire planet, the people that he thought actually he should talk to about this were actually the Jews. The Jews have therefore also had a message to the rest of the world. Think about this. One of the things that we never say about Zionism, somebody says, what is Zionism? So people will tell you it's colonialism, people will tell you it's whatever, and the people who are more inclined towards Zionism will tell you, oh, it's the desire to build a Jewish state. That's true and it's not true. What Zionism really is deep down, is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. That's what it is. It's a liberation movement. Then why do we not think about it that way? Because it was too darn successful too darn quickly. Think about it. 1897, Herzl and a few hundred Jews get together in a convention place, not quite as big as this, in Basel, Switzerland. By 1917, it's 20 years. Most of the people in this group understand that 20 years is just nothing. Right? There's a few people in the room right over here who are a little bit too young to know. They think 20 years is a really long time. You're just too young to understand that's not your fault, it's your parents' fault. But you'll get to our age, you'll understand 20 years is a blip in time. You go from a bunch of Jews in a hotel in Basel to 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, the most powerful empire on the planet, saying that it takes the idea that those Jews in that hotel had and it makes it the policy of the international community, essentially. That's just unbelievable. Right? Think about the fact that from 1917 to 1947, Balfour Declaration to the UN vote is just 30 years. I mean, think 30 years ago in America. In a lot of ways, tons of things have changed, and in a lot of ways, nothing has changed. Right? I mean, America 30 years ago was, more or less America now. Yeah, there's different politicians, and some people are happy and some people are not. But really, who cares about that for a time being? Just zoom out. Big time, America 30 years ago and America today, more or less the same thing. There's more websites now, big deal. Okay? But 30 years is not a huge, America 100 years ago was a very different place. America 200 years ago was a ridiculously different place. 30 years ago, it's exactly the same thing. But 30 years goes from the Balfour Declaration, just writing a little letter, to the United Nations voting in 1947 to actually create that state. I want to give you another example of the ways in which Israel, Jewish statehood, transformed the existential condition of the self of the Jews, the existential way in which the Jews think about themselves. Right? If 20 years is not a lot of time, and 30 years is not a lot of time, then 22 years is also not a lot of time. January 1945, Auschwitz is liberated by Russian soldiers. And everybody here has seen those videos and those photographs, and there's just nothing to say, right? I mean, it's just beyond, and we don't have to go into it. But the people who are still alive, if you can call that alive, who are straggling out, and many of them are going to die because the Russian soldiers, having such pity for them, are going to pull out their battle rations and give them the food, and their bodies can't digest food, so they're actually just going to die, right? But the people who are barely alive, they are the ultimate symbol of Jewish weakness, passivity, victimhood, not blaming them in any way whatsoever, but that's what they symbolize, that nobody was there for them. Nobody in the world gave a hoot. 22 years later was June 1967. 22 years later, the images are not of the people in the striped pajamas, or whatever you want to call them, coming out of the barbed wire, barely alive. 22 years later, it's the three paratroopers. David Rubinger's very famous photograph. Now, again, it's obviously not the same people. I understand that. But think about the transformation of the way in which Jews thought about themselves from 45 to 67. It's an unbelievable transformation. 22 years is overnight. And Jews have actually inspired liberation movements from across the world. The Kurds look to Israel. They actually get some assistance from Israel periodically, but the Kurds look to Israel. I'll tell you who else looks to Israel. The Palestinians. Now, they may not be doing it in the most strategically positive way, to put it mildly, and they may not be making the decisions that many of us in this group would want them to make, and some people probably think Israel isn't making the decisions they would want Israel to make. That's all well and good. But where did the idea of Palestinian nationalism come from? The Palestinians actually looked at the transformation that national sovereignty had done to a people that had been on the precipice of extinction. In 1945 or 1946, if somebody came up to you and said, "Tell me about the future of the Jews. You know, you're smart, you're sane, you're educated, you're exactly what all of you are," I assume, right? And somebody says to you, it's 1945, it's 1946, whatever it is, "Tell me about the future of the Jews." What are you going to possibly say? The center of the Jewish world had been Poland. That was the world's largest Jewish community. And when they heard in Palestine in 1940, towards the end of 1940, that Hitler was going to wipe out Polish Jewry, you know what they did? They laughed. They said, "What are you talking about? There's 3 million Polish Jews. You can't wipe out 3 million people. You guys are insane." Well, at the end of the war, there were 300,000 Polish Jews. 90% of them were in the air. Today, there's 30,000 Polish Jews. You actually can destroy an entire community of millions of people. And if you want to know if Hitler won or lost, if the question's Polish Jewry, Hitler totally won. If the question's Hungarian Jewry, Hitler totally won. If the question's German Jewry, Hitler totally won. Had the Japanese not been stupid enough to bomb Pearl Harbor, and the United States had taken longer to get into the war, God only knows what would have happened. But you go from this precipice of extinction, of utter passivity and victimhood, to 1967, and it shows the world, it shows the Kurds, it shows others, and it shows the Palestinians as well. A people can be reconstituted by virtue of sovereignty. A people can actually be changed. It can think about itself differently. And here's what I want to suggest to you. Forget the fact that we're at AIPAC. It doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum. It doesn't matter where you are on the religious spectrum. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not Jewish. It doesn't matter what race you are. When you think of yourself as a Jew, or you think of others, you think of the Jewish people, you think of them differently because they are part of a sovereign nation, whether they visit there or not, whether they live there or not. Sovereignty has changed the existential condition of the Jewish people the world over. And part of the great irony of the Jews who are actually very suspect about whether Israel's a good idea, or are so critical of Israel that Israel can do no right, and so on and so forth, is that they are very often too young and certainly not sufficiently sophisticated to understand how different was the way in which Jews thought about themselves and felt about themselves really not very long ago. Not 48, it's 67. That's the transformational period. And a lot of people in this crowd right here remember 1967 very well. I certainly do. In other words, this is a very, very, very new thing. And part of the irony of Israel's success is that a young generation of American Jews and a young generation of progressives in many cases, not all to be sure, but think of the Jewish people the way they do now without understanding that it's a direct result of sovereignty. And they think now you could nip the sovereignty in the bud and put a stop to it, and the Jewish people would still be the Jewish people. But that, of course, is ridiculous. That's just not going to happen. If, God forbid, for whatever reason, the Jewish state would not exist, the sense of forward thinking, the sense of ambition, the sense of pride, the sense of having been restored to the stage of the world as actors, all that would disappear. The Jews would lose that, but so would other peoples around the world who look to us actually as a model of how quickly sovereignty can actually transform the fate of a nation. I'm going to mention one last issue, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. The Jews have something to say. I mean, Jews have something to say about everything, right? But I don't mean that. The Jewish people have something to say. The Jewish people has something to say about slavery, and had it to say about slavery long before the rest of the world did. The Bible actually says slavery's fine. But the rabbis of the Talmud said it's not. Now, they couldn't say slavery's out because the Torah said it's okay. So what are they going to do? So they added all kinds of financial requirements that the slave owner had to have, that ultimately slavery became completely financially unsustainable, and the Jews were not in the slave business anymore. We're the first people in the history of the world to say that when you marry a woman, you're marrying a human being. Now, we hope that the marriage is going to work, but not all marriages do, just the nature of human life. And if you get tired of her, I'm now speaking in a male voice because that's the voice of the ancient times. If you get tired of her, you don't get to just dump her and walk on. You have to actually protect her financially. She has to have a roof over her head and food to eat and clothes to wear. That's what a ketubah is. When you sign a ketubah at your wedding, you're actually signing a document about your divorce. Now, you might say to yourself, how ridiculous is that? But it's not. It's the ultimate statement that we're talking about a revolution in human history of which the Jews were authors. Women are not property. Women are human beings. That's a Jewish idea. Monotheism was counter to the world. Jews have for a long time had something to say. Jews have for a long time had something to say about what an ideal society should look like. That's why Jews were at the forefront of communism. That's why Jews were at the forefront of socialism. And that's why Jews were at the forefront of capitalism, all three of which made us lots of friends, right? But we were at the forefront of those movements, and feminism, by the way, in the United States as well. We were at the forefront of those movements because Judaism has been infused with a social vision. Now, here's what we know. It's very nice to talk about your vision of a Jewish society sitting in the yeshiva of Volozhin in 1870. That's very nice. And it's meaningless. It only matters if you can actually try to do something about it. It only matters if you can actually say, for thousands of years, our people has been cultivating this set of ideas, but we want to take it out of the yeshiva. We want to take it out of the library. We want to take it off of the internet. And we actually want to put it into place and see how we can do. Now, are we doing perfectly? No. Are we doing pretty darn well? I would say yes. Is there a litany of things that I could keep you here with till tomorrow, of things about Israel that make me angry, ashamed, pull my hair out, whatever? Yes. And is it also the case that the valedictorian at Beersheba University Medical School a couple of years ago was a Bedouin woman? It is. Is it the case, for example, that Israel's had on more than one occasion an Arab member of the Supreme Court? It is. And I could go on and on. We all know those things. Is Israel giving its Arab citizens a completely fair shake? It is not. Show me any Western country that is giving its minorities a fair shake. Tragically, it is part of the nature of human history that it doesn't happen so easily. Does that let us off the hook? It doesn't let us off the hook. But it does mean, for example, that if you're a citizen of the Jewish state, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, makes no difference. The state has made a statement that by virtue of you being a citizen, you matter. So if you need a heart transplant, you get it for free. And if you need a throat culture, you get it for free. And when my daughter gave birth at Shaarei Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem, she didn't take out her credit card. She took out her health care card. And they swiped it so they'd know who she was. She had a baby. They sent her home. Done. Exactly 0.00 shekels. Why? Because the state says having babies is part of what people do. That's how a country perpetuates itself. If you care about your citizens, you educate them, you pick up their garbage, you protect them with an army. Why would you then not also protect their health? It makes no sense. It's very different from what happens here. The Jews, by the way, we have a lot of guns walking around in Israel. The guns themselves are not walking around. People are carrying them. But there's a lot of guns. Some of them you've seen, and many of them you don't. And they are very, very, very rarely used for nefarious purposes. Why? Because Jews speak in a right of duties, not in a right of rights. The whole notion of mitzvah, of commandedness, is a way of thinking about the world, and it even drips down to guns. When we moved to Israel and I started doing some journalistic stuff and I was traveling around in the West Bank and it was a second intifada, I decided I should get a gun. I should just carry a pistol with me in my glove compartment in case, God forbid, what. So I go to the right office, I fill out the form, they check me out, and I get turned down. Because they found something nasty in my background? No, they said you don't need it. People who don't need guns don't get guns. They decided I don't need it. What's the likelihood that I couldn't walk into a store not that far from here right now and walk out a half an hour later with an automatic rifle? Right? I mean, of course I could. Getting it home would probably be a bigger challenge, but I can walk out. Israel has a very different sense, and so we have a very different sense of obligation to each other and so on and so forth. All of this is a way of saying that part of what having a country does is it takes thousands of years of history, thousands of years of imagining society, and says, now let's see if we can actually make some of this happen. And reasonable minds can differ about whether or not we're doing well or very well or poorly or very poorly, etc. I want to end with this. At least until recent weeks, when Bibi Netanyahu has given us more fodder for conversation. But imagine ancient history, 4 weeks ago, when he was just a prince in shining armor. Most of the Israel conversations that you have around the fireplace, at your Shabbat table, in the picnic play table, on the golf course, in the schwitz, wherever you have your conversations, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that 80% at least of your conversations are about Israel and its conflict with the Palestinians, with the Syrians, with Hezbollah, with Hamas, whether Trump is good for Israel in the conflict. Even, by the way, the issue of the embassy is only an issue because of the conflict. And even whatever. 80-90% of the conversations that most people have about Israel are somehow about the conflict. I want to point out to you, now that I'm wrapping up, I haven't said a word about the conflict. Israel's not about the conflict. The United States has been at war every single solitary day since the end of World War II. Every single solitary day. There have been U.S. men and women in combat situations in one place or another. Sometimes more, sometimes less. The United States is definitely at war now. How many people did the United States kill yesterday in Afghanistan? I have no idea. You have no idea. I'm never going to know when you're never going to know. And people in America have just decided, including young American Jews, it's probably very sad. It's probably a terrible thing. I'm going to assume, hopefully, that people are actually trying to be reasonably moral about it, but it's not the way that I'm going to think about America. I got other fish to fry in America. I got women's rights. I got racial rights. I have freedom of the press. I got a whole set of issues here, and they've decided not to think about America through the lens only of the foreign conflicts in which it is involved. Why can't we do that about Israel as well? Whether we're Jewish or Gentile, whether we're Democrats or Republicans, whether we're religious or somewhere else on the spectrum, whether we are gay or straight, whether you name it, I don't care. Why can't the conversation that we're having about Israel be about the ways in which Israel has changed how the Jews think about themselves and how the Jews see the world? So that means talking about Israeli literature, and it means talking about Israeli film, and it means talking about Israeli modern dance, and it means talking about what's going on in Israeli culture and all kinds of other stuff. And yes, there's a conflict. It's a horrible conflict. It's been around since everybody in this setting was alive, and I would suggest to you, by the way, that it's going to be around throughout the lifetimes of everybody sitting here. It's tragic. It's horrible. My kids have all fought in it. It's terrible. But it's not what Israel is. And so if this little presentation accomplishes anything, I want to hopefully beg you to think that what Israel's done is it's fundamentally changed the existential condition of the Jew. There are no homeless Jews in the world anymore. There are homeless Jews, but you know what I mean. There's no Jews that have nowhere to go in the world. We have a language as a people because of Israel. We're actors back on the stage of history because of the state of Israel. There are other peoples around the world who look to us as a model for inspiration because of Israel. We have a kind of a laboratory in which we can take thousands of years of Jewish ideas and see what kind of a society we can build. Again, for better or for worse, better or poor, it doesn't really make any difference right now. It matters a hell of a lot there, but not for this conversation. But that's all a conversation about Israel in which the very sad, tragic conflict is not front and center. We need a state because the state enables the Jewish people to be a people like other peoples who can take their ideas and bring them to the fore in a place that they call their own. The Jewish state has accomplished that so unbelievably successfully that we no longer think it's that interesting. The Jewish state has accomplished that so unbelievably successfully that we don't recognize anymore how new it is that the Jewish people can do that. And our challenge, I would suggest to you, again, no matter where we are religiously, politically, whatever, is when we leave this conference to go out there and to convince and to convey to the people that we're in touch with that what Israel is not a country at war. What Israel is not a country to conflict, but what Israel is the fulfillment of the Jewish people's national liberation movement. It's a country that has forever changed the existential condition of the Jewish people, and that our sacred responsibility is to make sure that 100 years from now, people can sit in this same exact conference center and talk about the extraordinary accomplishments that Israel had between 2018 and 2118. Thanks very much.